Propaganda had painted a grim picture. The Americans would seize everything: their homes, their dignity, their very future. Yet, in September 1945, as thousands of Japanese mothers gathered outside Tokyo's Sugamo prison, the enemy delivered a return far beyond their wildest hopes: their children. These women had braced themselves for a cruel occupation, for the sting of grief, for doors slammed shut in their faces. Instead, American soldiers emerged, each gently leading a small child by the hand. Mothers collapsed to their knees, not in defeat, but in stunned disbelief. The war had instilled in them a deep, visceral fear of their adversaries. That day, however, began to rewrite everything they believed. If this profound story resonates with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more untold narratives from World War II history. A biting chill pierced the Tokyo air as autumn dawned. September arrived, its crispness cutting through threadbare coats and worn-thin shoes. Though the war had officially ended, its cruel aftermath lingered for most Japanese civilians. Food remained desperately scarce, homes lay in rubble, and countless families were fractured beyond recognition. In the capital's devastated landscape, where skeletal buildings pierced the sky like broken teeth and distant fires still sent tendrils of smoke upward, thousands of women converged outside the formidable walls of Sugamo prison. From every ravaged corner of the city, they came. Some had walked for hours across bomb-blasted streets, while others pedaled bicycles with deflated tires, their journeys arduous. Many were draped in traditional kimonos, now dulled by ash and grime. Months of relentless hunger had hollowed their faces, and sleepless nights cast dark shadows beneath their eyes. A few clutched small bundles, a desperate hope to offer something, anything, to the children they hadn't seen in weeks or even months. Others arrived empty-handed, their hearts heavy with uncertainty, unsure if their agonizing search would yield anything but despair. The prison itself stood like an ominous fortress, its towering walls crowned with glinting barbed wire, its gates rigidly guarded by American soldiers in impeccably crisp uniforms. For these women, the Americans remained the undeniable enemy, the ones who had rained fire from the skies, incinerating their cities and shattering their familiar world. Propaganda had relentlessly hammered home the message. Occupation meant utter humiliation, American soldiers were inherently cruel, and the Japanese people would be treated no better than animals. As morning gave way to midday, the crowd swelled exponentially, transforming from hundreds to thousands. Women clustered together, their voices hushed, exchanging what meager fragments of information they possessed. A fortunate few carried small slips of paper, official notices instructing them to appear at Sugamo at a specific hour. The majority, however, were fueled by desperate rumors alone, whispers of children being held within, of impending releases, of the faint possibility that families might, against all odds, be reunited. The olfactory landscape of Tokyo in autumn 1945 was indelible, a pervasive odor of ash and charred timber, damp earth, and grim decay. But on this particular morning, an entirely different scent mingled in the air. From beyond the prison walls drifted the faint, almost ethereal aroma of soap and cooked food. These clean, wholesome smells felt jarringly, impossibly out of place in a city where most residents hadn't enjoyed a proper meal in months. The sounds, too, were disquieting and alien. The women heard American voices issuing commands in English, incomprehensible words, yet tones that conveyed a clear sense of organization and methodical purpose. There was the deep rumble of truck engines springing to life, the metallic clang of massive gates, and the soft shuffle of countless feet. And then, beneath it all, barely perceptible at first, came the sound that seized every mother's heart: the high, clear voices of children. The visual contrast was jarringly stark. Outside the forbidding gates, the women stood in their threadbare, patched garments, their faces etched with worry and profound exhaustion. Inside, through the slender gaps in the fence, American soldiers moved with confident purpose, their uniforms pristine, their demeanor self-assured. This stark juxtaposition felt almost cruel. Here stood the victorious and the vanquished, divided by unforgiving iron bars, yet fatefully drawn together by circumstances neither side could have ever foreseen. Near the front of the tense throng stood Ko, one mother among thousands. She had journeyed 3 arduous hours from her devastated neighborhood, clutching a carefully wrapped photograph of her daughter, Yuki. This image was among the precious few possessions she had salvaged when American bombs had leveled her home. Yuki, a 7-year-old with soft, round cheeks and shy eyes, hadn't been seen by Ko in 2 agonizing months. Not since the final, chaotic days of Tokyo, when children were hastily evacuated to the countryside and families brutally torn asunder. When the massive gates finally began their slow, grinding retreat, a collective hush descended upon the multitude. It wasn't an absolute silence, but rather a universal holding of breath, as if 3,000 individual hearts had fused into one nervous, palpitating entity. The mothers instinctively surged forward, then faltered, caught between the impulse to rush ahead and the uncertainty of waiting. Fear and fragile hope waged a fierce, internal battle within every single chest. An American officer, flanked by 2 armed soldiers, stepped purposefully into the opening. He delivered his address first in English, then paused as a young Japanese translator, dressed in civilian clothes, relayed his words. The message was astoundingly simple, yet earth-shattering. The children held within had been cared for throughout the war's final, chaotic weeks. They had been fed, clothed, and kept safe. Now they were to be reunited with their families. The crowd erupted in an overwhelming wave of sound, a cacophony of raw emotion. Some women shrieked in sheer, unadulterated relief. Others openly sobbed, tears streaming down their gaunt faces. Still others remained utterly frozen, their minds struggling to process the impossible words they had just heard. Ko felt her legs buckle beneath her. The Americans had kept the children safe. They had fed them. It utterly defied every single piece of propaganda, every deeply ingrained belief about the brutality of occupation. And then the children began to emerge. They passed through the gates in small, tentative groups, each accompanied by an American soldier. The soldiers proceeded slowly, with a surprising gentleness, holding the hands of the smallest children and patiently guiding the older ones forward. The children appeared remarkably clean. Their simple clothes, though basic, were intact and freshly laundered. Their faces, while perhaps uncertain, showed no telltale signs of hunger or lingering fear. The sight shattered something profound within the mothers. This was utterly unlike anything they had braced themselves for. They had steeled their hearts against anticipated cruelty, against callous indifference, against the crushing possibility of finding their children damaged or deeply traumatized. Instead, they beheld healthy, cared-for children, tended to by the very people they had been indoctrinated to despise. Ko desperately scanned the sea of small faces, her eyes frantically searching for Yuki. And then there she was. Yuki stood near the center of a group, her tiny hand clasped in that of a tall, red-haired American soldier. The soldier was bending low, speaking to Yuki in English, and though the little girl clearly didn't comprehend his words, she was nodding, a faint, trusting smile gracing her lips. Ko's knees buckled. She crumpled to the hard pavement, the cherished photograph slipping from her grasp, her voice cracking as she choked out Yuki's name. All around her, other mothers mirrored her reaction. Falling to the ground, reaching out with trembling arms, their bodies overcome by the raw shock of reunion. The suffocating fear they had carried for so long, the dread that had tormented their sleepless nights, it all began to fissure and crack. Every small step their children took toward them felt like an impossible miracle, unfolding before their utterly disbelieving eyes. Yuki heard her name echoing and turned. The sight of her mother, kneeling on the ground with outstretched arms, instantly transformed her small face. She wrenched her hand free from the American soldier's grasp and bolted. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 20 feet. Yet to Ko, it felt like an eternity. Yuki crashed into her arms with a force that sent them both staggering sideways. Ko clutched her daughter so fiercely that Yuki let out a soft gasp. For a long, silent moment, Ko found herself unable to speak. She buried her face in Yuki's hair, inhaling the precious scent of her child, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of her body. Yuki smelled clean, like soap and something faintly sweet, perhaps the milk she had been given. Her hair was neatly combed, her clothes entirely free of dirt. Ko finally pulled back, cupping Yuki's small face in her trembling hands, frantically searching for any telltale signs of suffering, of trauma, of the unspeakable horrors she had so vividly imagined. But Yuki appeared healthy. Her cheeks held a faint color. Her eyes sparkled with youthful brightness. She was undoubtedly thinner than before, yes, but not emaciated, not broken. Ko's mind reeled, grappling with the incomprehensible. How was this even possible? The Americans were meant to be monstrous, intent on harming Japanese civilians to exact their vengeful retribution for the war. Yet, here stood Yuki, alive and well, lovingly returned by the very soldiers who had reduced their city to ashes. All around them, the scene replicated itself again and again. Mothers and children reuniting in overwhelming waves of tears and profound relief. Some mothers held their children, dissolving into unrestrained sobs. Others laughed joyously through their tears, tenderly touching their children's faces, hands, and hair as if to confirm their palpable reality. A few simply sank to the ground, too utterly overwhelmed to stand, clutching their sons and daughters as if they might vanish at any given moment. The American soldiers respectfully retreated, affording the reunited families their sacred space. Some appeared visibly uncomfortable with the raw, potent emotion unfolding before their eyes. Others watched with expressions that hinted at satisfaction, or perhaps a private sense of relief of their own. They had fulfilled their duty, and this, indeed, was the extraordinary outcome. It was certainly not a sight most of them had anticipated witnessing upon their initial arrival in Japan. One soldier, the tall redhead who had been holding Yuki's hand, now slowly approached Ko. He crouched down beside her, extending a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Through earnest gestures and the handful of Japanese words he had managed to learn, he conveyed that these were Yuki's personal belongings. Ko accepted the bundle with trembling hands, bowing her head repeatedly, the only way she knew to express the overwhelming gratitude swelling within her. The soldier offered a gentle smile and a reassuring pat on Yuki's head before quietly moving away. Later, when Ko carefully unwrapped the bundle at home, she discovered a clean change of clothes, a small bar of precious chocolate, and a piece of paper bearing Yuki's name, meticulously penned in careful English letters. She would treasure that paper for years to come, an enduring tangible reminder of the day her world ceased to adhere to any logical sense. As families commenced their long, weary journey home, the children began to recount their stories, speaking in fragmented sentences, their young minds struggling to process the bewildering experiences they had endured. Yuki excitedly told her mother about the large, comfortable beds with clean sheets, the nourishing meals served 3 times a day, and the American soldiers who offered them candy and patiently taught them simple English words. Other children shared remarkably similar accounts. They described being given baths with warm water and real soap, talked about doctors who carefully checked them for illnesses and provided medicine when they were sick. They even spoke of games organized by the soldiers, simple pleasures like tossing a ball or drawing pictures. One boy, barely 5 years old, proudly showed his mother a crude drawing. Stick figures depicting an American soldier and a Japanese child, hands clasped together. The mothers listened intently, their faces a complex tapestry of confusion and dawning wonder. With each new story, another layer of their long-held beliefs chipped away. The wartime propaganda had been so pervasive, so utterly convincing. They had been indoctrinated to believe Americans were savage demons who would show no mercy, that Japanese civilians would face unimaginable suffering under their brutal rule. Yet, the irrefutable evidence before them contradicted every single claim. Their children had been protected, nourished, and treated with something that bore a disturbing resemblance to genuine kindness. An elderly woman named Hannah walked beside Ko, clutching her 8-year-old grandson, Taro, who proved more talkative than Yuki. Taro eagerly described how the Americans had established a makeshift school within the prison, where they were taught basic hygiene and given books to read. He even spoke of a soldier named Joe, who had proudly shown him photographs of his own children back in America, 2 boys roughly Taro's age. Hannah listened in profound silence, her weathered face an inscrutable mask. Finally, her voice barely a whisper, she articulated a crushing truth. The enemy showed more care for our children than our own government did. In the quiet aftermath, her words hung heavy in the crisp autumn air, a truth too painful for anyone to truly acknowledge. That evening, in homes throughout Tokyo, mothers sat with their returned children, grappling with a jarring new reality. The profound joy of reunion was inextricably intertwined with a deep, unsettling confusion. They had survived years of brutal warfare, endured relentless bombings and widespread starvation, and mourned the loss of husbands, brothers, and fathers. They had been indoctrinated to believe their suffering was noble, their sacrifice paramount for the emperor, for the nation, for a glorious cause. But now, clutching their clean, healthy children, they began to voice questions they had never dared to utter before. If the Americans were truly as cruel as they had been portrayed, why had they diligently kept the children safe? If the enemy was genuinely so monstrous, why had they bothered to feed and clothe children belonging to a nation they had just utterly defeated? The cognitive dissonance proved utterly overwhelming. Ko sat with Yuki curled contentedly against her side, the small bar of chocolate resting on the table between them. She had meticulously cut it into tiny pieces, intending to make it last, to ration it with the same discipline she had applied to everything during the war. But Yuki had insisted her mother share, and so they had, the exquisite sweetness exploding on their tongues like a taste from an entirely different world. As Yuki drifted into an exhausted sleep, overcome by the day's emotions, Ko gazed at the piece of paper bearing her daughter's name. The handwriting was careful, almost tender. Someone had taken the deliberate time to write Yuki's name, to ensure her proper identification, to guarantee her return to the correct family. It was such a minuscule detail, yet it spoke volumes of an astonishing attention to detail, a level of care Ko had never dared to anticipate. In that profound moment, seated in her damaged home with her peacefully sleeping daughter beside her, Ko felt an undeniable shift deep within her spirit. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. The Americans had, after all, still laid waste to her city, had still taken the lives of those she cherished. But it was something far more intricate, more complex. It was the dawning recognition that the enemy was not the simplistic monster she had been indoctrinated to believe in. The enemy was human, and that startling humanity made everything infinitely more difficult to reconcile. The days succeeding the reunion proved profoundly strange for all involved. The children had to painstakingly readjust to life beyond the prison walls, to homes often damaged or utterly destroyed, to neighborhoods that scarcely resembled the places they had known. Countless families had lost everything in the relentless bombings, now living in makeshift shelters cobbled together from scavenged materials, sleeping on hard floors, cooking over rudimentary fires, and subsisting on whatever meager food they could forage or acquire with their scarce rations. For the mothers, the stark contrast was agonizing. Their children had spent weeks in conditions that, while certainly not opulent, had been vastly superior to the harsh reality most Japanese civilians were enduring. The children had eaten regular meals, slept in actual beds, and experienced warmth and safety. Now, they were thrust back into a world of acute scarcity and relentless struggle, and the mothers couldn't help but wrestle with an overwhelming sense of shame. Yuki's adjustment was slow and arduous. No longer did she enjoy 3 consistent meals a day. Instead, she ate only what Ko could scrounge. Thin rice gruel in the morning, perhaps a sliver of fish or a meager vegetable at midday, and more gruel at night. Gone was her warm bed, replaced by a thin mat in the corner of their damaged house, wrapped in whatever salvaged blankets Ko possessed. The transition was undeniably harsh, and sometimes Yuki would pose questions that utterly broke Ko's heart. Why don't we have soap like the soldiers had? When can we have chocolate again? Ko had no answers to offer. She could only hold her daughter tightly and promise that things would eventually improve, despite having no genuine idea if that promise held any truth. While the occupation had undeniably imposed a semblance of order upon Tokyo, it had yet to usher in prosperity. The Americans now held undisputed control of the city, their omnipresent presence manifest everywhere. Jeeps rumbled through the streets, soldiers stood guard at every intersection, and English signs appeared on buildings. For many Japanese, it served as an unceasing, stark reminder of their profound defeat. Yet, the occupation was not nearly as brutal as countless had feared. The Americans did establish rules, certainly, but these were neither arbitrary nor wantonly cruel. They systematically set up food distribution centers, organized essential work programs, and embarked on the painstaking process of rebuilding shattered infrastructure. Japanese civilians, who had braced themselves for torture and oppression, instead encountered something far more perplexing: order, unexpected fairness, and a strange, methodical efficiency. As weeks turned into months, a richer tapestry of stories emerged concerning the children's time in American custody. Mothers exchanged information at the communal water pumps, in the long food distribution lines, and within the temporary shelters where they sought refuge from the biting cold. Each new account added another crucial layer to the evolving narrative. The children, it turned out, had been housed in various locations during the war's final, chaotic days, some within Sugamo prison, others in provisional camps established by American forces. The military had discovered them wandering aimlessly through the devastated streets, separated from their families amidst the bewildering chaos of evacuations and bombings. Rather than abandoning them to fend for themselves, the Americans had systematically gathered them, meticulously documented their identities, and provided consistent care until their eventual return to their families. The logistical undertaking had been nothing short of impressive. The Americans had devised a system to track each child, recording their names and any available family information. They had specifically assigned soldiers to supervise the children, ensuring their nourishment and safety. They had even arranged for Japanese-speaking translators to facilitate communication and alleviate the children's fears. This remarkable level of organization stood in stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the utter chaos that had characterized the final months of Japanese wartime control. As the tides of war inexorably turned against Japan, the military's sole focus had been on combat, not on the protection of its own civilian populace. Families had been hastily ordered to evacuate cities, yet without any clear plan, any discernible system to track who went where. Children had been tragically separated from their parents in the ensuing confusion, dispatched to the countryside with no assurance of ever being reunited. The mothers remembered those desperate days with a searing bitterness. They recalled being exhorted to sacrifice everything for the war effort, to surrender their sons to the military, to endure starvation and hardship for the emperor. They remembered the hollow promises of impending victory, that their suffering would ultimately be rewarded. But victory never materialized. Instead, there had been fire raining from the sky, cities reduced to ash, and a humiliating surrender that left them adrift in a world that had ceased to make any rational sense. And now, in that broken, bewildered world, it was the enemy providing structure and compassionate care. It was the enemy who had kept their precious children alive. This profound contradiction gnawed relentlessly at their souls, utterly impossible to ignore. Not every interaction between Japanese civilians and American soldiers unfolded easily or comfortably. An underlying tension persisted, a lingering mistrust palpable on both sides. Some soldiers harbored deep resentment toward the Japanese, having lost friends and comrades in the brutal Pacific fighting. Similarly, many Japanese civilians found it impossible to relinquish their profound anger at the nation that had firebombed their cities and claimed the lives of their loved ones. Yet, amidst this friction, there were also moments of unexpected human connection. Ko experienced one such moment a few weeks after Yuki's return. She had been standing in a seemingly endless line at a food distribution center, patiently awaiting her weekly ration of rice and canned goods. The wait was tedious, the November cold beginning to bite, and Yuki shivered visibly beside her in her thin coat. An American soldier was overseeing the distribution, meticulously checking names against a list, ensuring order was maintained. He appeared young, perhaps in his early 20s, his face tired but his eyes undeniably kind. As Ko finally reached the front of the line, Yuki suddenly gasped, tugging urgently on her mother's sleeve. "It's Joe!" she exclaimed excitedly, pointing directly at the soldier. The soldier looked down at Yuki, and his tired face instantly softened into a genuine smile. He uttered something in English, a greeting Yuki couldn't understand but instinctively recognized as friendly. Then, he reached into his pocket and produced a piece of gum, offering it directly to the little girl. Ko hesitated, momentarily unsure if she should permit such a gesture. But Yuki had already eagerly accepted the gum, beaming up at the soldier with unadulterated joy. Ko bowed deeply, the only way she knew to convey her profound gratitude. The soldier waved off her thanks, then gestured toward Yuki and mimed eating, clearly inquiring if she was receiving sufficient nourishment. Ko nodded, though both knew it wasn't entirely true. The soldier seemed to understand. He handed Ko her standard rations. Then, with a swift, almost surreptitious motion that discouraged any fuss, added an extra can of food from his personal supplies, pressing it into her hands. As Ko walked away, the unexpected can heavy in her bag, tears pricked her eyes. It was such a small act of kindness, yet it carried an immense, inexplicable weight. This soldier, this supposed enemy who had every conceivable reason to despise her and her people, had instead chosen to help. He had recognized Yuki, remembered her, and cared enough to ensure she received a little extra sustenance. That evening, Ko opened the additional can, revealing glistening peaches suspended in syrup. She and Yuki shared them slowly, savoring each precious bite, the sweetness almost painfully intense after months of relentlessly bland rations. As they ate, Yuki chattered excitedly about Joe, about how he had taught her to say thank you in English, about the photographs he had shown her of his family. Ko listened, her heart heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite articulate. It was indeed gratitude, but also profound confusion, and perhaps a dawning, unsettling realization that the world was far more intricate than the simplistic narratives she had been fed. The inherent contradiction persisted, a relentless whisper. Memory brutally collided with lived reality. The irony of it all felt almost unbearable. Winter descended upon Tokyo, ushering in biting winds and blankets of snow. The city remained largely in ruins, yet, agonizingly slowly, a rebuilding effort began. The American occupation endured, and with it came a gradual, profound shift in how many Japanese civilians perceived their occupiers. The wartime propaganda, once so absolute, now seemed increasingly hollow in the face of daily, tangible reality. For the mothers who had miraculously received their children back, this transformation was especially profound. They simply could not reconcile the entrenched image of Americans as cruel monsters with the irrefutable evidence before their very eyes. Their children had been cared for. Food was being systematically distributed. Schools were gradually reopening. The occupation was undeniably strict, yes, but it was certainly not the living nightmare they had been led to anticipate. Ko wrestled fiercely with her conflicting emotions throughout that long winter. A part of her still clung tenaciously to the anger she harbored against the Americans for the devastation they had wrought upon Japan. She vividly recalled the night Tokyo had burned, when B-29 bombers unleashed incendiary bombs that transformed the city into an inferno. She remembered the suffocating smell of smoke and burning flesh, the desperate screams of people trapped in their blazing homes, and the chilling morning after, when streets lay strewn with charred bodies. That visceral rage did not simply vanish because an American soldier had offered Yuki a piece of gum. Yet, another part of her slowly recognized that the Americans were demonstrating a level of humanity that her own government had tragically failed to provide. The Japanese military had been prepared to sacrifice its own civilians, to fight to the last man, woman, and child if deemed necessary. The Americans, however, despite their decisive victory, despite possessing every perceived right to seek vengeance, had deliberately chosen an alternative path. They could have been brutally oppressive. They chose instead to be fair. Late one sleepless night, Ko sat by the small, meager fire they used for warmth, her thoughts turning to the chocolate bar that had accompanied Yuki. That small confection represented something far grander than itself. It was a potent symbol of abundance, of a nation so immensely wealthy it could afford to bestow sweets upon the children of its enemies. But it was also, crucially, a symbol of choice. The Americans had chosen to give it. They were under no obligation. They could have hoarded everything for themselves, could have treated Japanese children with utter indifference or outright cruelty. Yet they had not. Ko pondered the profound implications. If the enemy could demonstrate such unexpected care, what did that reveal about the cause Japan had been fighting for? If Americans could, in fact, be humane, could Japanese propaganda have been fundamentally wrong about everything else, too? These were perilous thoughts, treasonous even, despite the emperor himself having commanded surrender. But they persisted, deepening and strengthening with each passing day. Ko was far from alone in her internal struggle. Across Tokyo and other occupied cities, Japanese civilians grappled with these same perplexing questions. Men returning from the war, those who had miraculously survived and been released from prisoner-of-war camps, brought back their own astounding stories. Many spoke of being treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, of receiving proper medical care, and of American guards who, while firm, had been undeniably fair. At community gatherings, the topic surfaced repeatedly, discussed in hushed tones as people tentatively shared their experiences of the occupation. They spoke of organized food distributions, of American doctors treating Japanese patients, of schools reopening with new textbooks that presented vastly different versions of history. Some steadfastly resisted these shifts, clinging fiercely to the old beliefs. Others, particularly the younger generation, proved more receptive, more willing to question the doctrines they had been taught. Hannah, the elderly woman whose grandson had been returned, became a frequent confidant for Ko. Having lived through the Meiji Restoration, Hannah had witnessed Japan's radical transformation from a feudal society into a modern nation. She possessed a unique perspective born of age, a seasoned willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One afternoon, as they sat together peeling vegetables for the newly established communal soup kitchen, Hannah spoke her mind. "We were taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor," Hannah remarked quietly. "We were taught that surrender was shameful, that the enemy would show no mercy. But look at us now. We surrendered and we are alive. Our children are alive. The Americans could have utterly annihilated us, yet they did not. What does that tell you about everything we were taught?" Ko did not answer immediately. The question was too immense, too dangerous to fully address. But it resonated deeply in her mind, merging with the growing tide of doubts that had been steadily accumulating. Ko's thoughts drifted to Yuki, to how her daughter was now diligently learning English in school, how she came home excitedly speaking of democracy and human rights, concepts utterly alien during the war years. The children, it seemed, were adapting far more swiftly than their parents. They held less investment in the old, failed ways, less loyalty to ideologies that had ultimately betrayed them. Yuki no longer spoke of American soldiers with fear. Instead, her tone was one of curiosity, sometimes even fondness. She would ask her mother why they couldn't live more like the Americans, why they couldn't possess the amenities she had experienced during her time in custody. These questions, while painful for Ko, simultaneously compelled her to think. Asterisk, why not? Asterisk, why couldn't Japan rebuild itself differently, embracing some of the values and systems that imbued America with such undeniable power? It was a profoundly radical thought, one that would have been utterly unthinkable just a year prior. But now, in the harsh reality of occupation and the imperative of survival, it no longer seemed so radical after all. As winter gradually yielded to spring, a fundamental shift had occurred in how many Japanese civilians perceived the occupation, and by extension, themselves. The Americans, it became clear, had not arrived solely to destroy Japan. They had come to rebuild it, to fundamentally transform it into something new. This was not, of course, an act of pure altruism. The Americans undeniably held strategic interests in the Pacific, and a stable, democratic Japan would serve those interests well. Yet, the methods they employed, the unexpected care they consistently demonstrated, suggested something far deeper than mere geopolitical calculation. Ko began to view the occupation through an entirely new lens. The Americans weren't merely imposing their will upon a defeated nation. They were actively offering a divergent vision of what that nation could ultimately become. They were demonstrating to the Japanese people that there existed another means of organizing society, an alternative way to ascribe value to human life. The contrast with the preceding era was stark and undeniable. Under the militarist government that had propelled Japan into war, individual lives had been considered utterly expendable. The collective, the nation, the emperor, these alone had been paramount. Personal desires, individual rights, these were deemed selfish, antithetical to the greater good. The chilling result had been a society capable of dispatching young men to perish in feudal-style battles, of commanding civilians to fight to the death rather than surrender, of sacrificing entire cities in the relentless pursuit of military objectives. The Americans, however, operated from fundamentally different principles. They demonstrably valued individual human life. They possessed established systems designed to protect rights, to ensure fairness, and to actively prevent the kind of absolute, unchecked power that had tragically steered Japan down its dark, destructive path. These systems were, of course, far from perfect, and the Americans themselves did not always perfectly embody their own high ideals. Nevertheless, the ideals themselves were incredibly potent, and they resonated profoundly with a people who had just survived the devastating consequences of their absence. One day in early spring, Ko took Yuki to witness the cherry blossoms. The resilient trees had remarkably survived the war, and their vibrant bloom felt like a tangible promise that life would persistently continue, that beauty could still miraculously exist. As they strolled beneath the ephemeral pink canopy, Yuki posed a question that stopped Ko dead in her tracks. "Mama, do you think the soldiers who took care of me were bad people?" Ko looked down at her daughter, at the pure innocence reflected in her eyes, and felt something profound give way inside her. "No," she finally managed to say, her voice soft with revelation. "I do not think they were bad people. I think they were people just like us. And that is what I should have understood all along." This recognition was undeniably painful. It meant acknowledging that the relentless propaganda had been a fabric of lies, that the entire war had been predicated on false premises, and that an immeasurable amount of suffering could have been averted if people had simply been willing to perceive their enemies as fellow human beings. But it was also profoundly liberating. It meant that the future was not condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. It meant that fundamental change was truly possible. If the enemy values our lives, Ko mused, asterisk, why did we not value our own? Asterisk, perhaps captivity, paradoxically, revealed more profound truths than freedom ever could. Kindness, she realized, cuts deeper than cruelty. The true turning point arrived on a warm May day in 1946, nearly a full year after the war's conclusion. The occupation had settled into a nascent new normal. Tokyo, though still bearing grievous scars, was slowly seeing new buildings emerge from its vast ruins. Markets were reopening, and life, slowly but steadily, was beginning its arduous return. Ko had secured work assisting at one of the American distribution centers. It was straightforward labor, organizing crates and managing inventory, but it provided a small, steady income that eased the burden of survival. More crucially, it brought her into daily, direct contact with American soldiers and civilian workers. Through these ongoing interactions, she began to learn more about the very country that had once been her bitter enemy. One afternoon, she found herself working alongside a young American woman named Sarah, a Red Cross volunteer who possessed a rudimentary grasp of Japanese. They had cultivated a cautious friendship, forged in shared tasks and simple, tentative conversations. Sarah had shown Ko photographs of her hometown in Iowa, images of broad, tree-lined streets, perfectly intact buildings, and children playing without a trace of fear. The stark contrast with Tokyo's devastation had been emotionally overwhelming. On this particular day, Sarah inquired about Ko's personal experiences during the war. Ko hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, but Sarah's expression conveyed genuine interest, devoid of judgment, and slowly, tentatively, Ko began to speak. She recounted losing her home in the relentless bombings, the agonizing separation from Yuki, the paralyzing terror and profound uncertainty of those final weeks. Then she spoke of that unforgettable day at Sugamo prison, of witnessing Yuki emerge, her hand clasped in an American soldier's, of collapsing to her knees in sheer disbelief. As she narrated the story, her voice wavered, thick with raw emotion. She described the profound shock of discovering Yuki had been meticulously cared for, the ensuing confusion, and the gradual, unsettling realization that everything she had ever believed about Americans had been utterly wrong. Sarah listened in solemn silence, and when Ko finished, tears welled in the young woman's eyes. "I am so incredibly glad you got her back," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with empathy. "I am so glad our soldiers took care of her. We did not want this war. We did not want to hurt civilians, but once it began, we tried our utmost to remember that even enemies are, at their core, human beings." This seemingly simple statement struck Ko with the force of a profound revelation. That was it. That was the fundamental distinction. The Japanese military had ceased to perceive the enemy as human, reducing them instead to abstract threats to be utterly annihilated. The Americans, however, despite their own propaganda and ingrained hatred, had managed to retain enough humanity to extend care to enemy children. That deliberate choice, that steadfast retention of basic human decency, even amidst the brutality of war, had made every conceivable difference. That evening, as she walked home through the steadily rebuilding streets, Ko felt as though she was perceiving the world with pristine clarity for the first time in years. The dense fog of propaganda, of ingrained fear, of nationalist ideology had finally, mercifully lifted. What remained was simple, yet profoundly resonant. We are all human. We all endure suffering. We all cherish our children. These fundamental truths transcended nationality, transcended the arbitrary lines that had once so rigidly divided victor from vanquished. Upon reaching home, she found Yuki diligently doing her homework, practicing her English letters. Her daughter looked up and offered a radiant smile, a simple, uncomplicated expression of pure happiness. In that precise moment, Ko understood the true magnitude of what the Americans had given her. It was far more than just Yuki's physical return. It was the tangible possibility of an entirely different future, one not built on corrosive hatred and endless sacrifice, but on mutual respect and the profound recognition of shared humanity. The transformation was complete. The woman who had knelt in terror at Sugamo's gates, braced for the absolute worst, had vanished. In her place stood someone new, someone who now grasped that the enemy had demonstrated more mercy than her own government, and that this mercy was not a symbol of weakness, but an undeniable testament to strength. The Americans had unequivocally demonstrated that it was entirely possible to win a war and yet steadfastly maintain one's humanity, to decisively defeat an enemy and still treat them with inherent dignity. This, Ko realized, was the most formidable weapon the Americans possessed. Not their devastating bombs or their overwhelming armies, but their extraordinary capacity to transform bitter enemies into steadfast allies through simple, consistent acts of decency. By safely returning the children, by treating Japanese civilians with fundamental respect, they had sown potent seeds of change that would fundamentally reshape Japan in ways military occupation alone could never have achieved. The American occupation of Japan continued until 1952, a pivotal 7-year period during which the nation underwent fundamental transformations. A new constitution was meticulously drafted, one that boldly guaranteed individual rights and firmly established Japan as a vibrant democracy. War itself was formally renounced as a sovereign right. Women, for the first time, gained the right to vote. Sweeping land reforms dismantled the archaic feudal estates, and education was radically reformed to emphasize critical thinking over rote obedience. Ko lived to witness all of these monumental changes. She watched as Tokyo painstakingly rebuilt itself from its shattered ruins into a gleaming, modern metropolis. She saw Yuki blossom from a child into a confident young woman, one who carried no memory of militarist Japan, having been raised entirely within a democratic society. Yuki learned English fluently, pursued higher education at university, and eventually became a teacher herself, passionately dedicated to educating the next generation about the profound importance of peace and mutual understanding. In the 1960s, Ko became actively involved in a program that facilitated exchanges between Japanese and American students. Her profound desire was for young people on both sides to genuinely understand one another, to look beyond the ingrained stereotypes and pervasive propaganda to recognize the shared humanity beneath. She frequently recounted the story of Sugamo prison to these students, vividly describing the moment she had fallen to her knees at the sight of Yuki being returned by an American soldier. The narrative consistently evoked a powerful impact. American students were deeply moved by the realization that their countrymen had chosen mercy over vengeance. Japanese students were confronted with the uncomfortable yet vital truth that their former enemies had exhibited more profound care for Japanese children than their own government had. Both groups departed with a far deeper comprehension of the intricate complexities of war, the paramount importance of maintaining humanity even amidst conflict, and the transformative possibility of reconciliation. What transpired at Sugamo prison in September 1945 was but one poignant fragment of a much larger narrative. Thousands of children were lovingly returned to their families throughout the occupation, each reunion a miniature miracle in itself. But the broader, more enduring significance resided in what these collective acts truly represented. The Americans possessed the power to be cruel. They deliberately chose kindness. They could have pursued vengeance. They opted instead to rebuild. This profound choice irrevocably shaped the relationship between Japan and the United States in the ensuing decades. The two nations, once bitter adversaries, evolved into close, unwavering allies. The occupation, despite its inherent challenges and imperfections, was largely regarded as a success precisely because it was fundamentally grounded in a mutual recognition of shared humanity. For the mothers who received their children back, the impact was profoundly personal and indelible. They carried the vivid memory of that extraordinary day for the remainder of their lives. Many, like Ko, perceived it as a pivotal turning point, the precise moment they began to grasp that the world was far more complex than the simplistic narratives of us versus them, good versus evil. Their children matured in a new Japan, one that unequivocally rejected the militarism of their parents' generation and wholeheartedly embraced democracy. And the mothers inherently understood that this monumental transformation had been possible because, at a critical juncture, someone had chosen mercy over vengeance. Hannah, the elderly woman who had walked alongside Ko on that initial momentous day, lived to see her great-grandchildren born into a prosperous, peaceful Japan. Before her passing in 1975, she granted an interview to a local newspaper, reflecting on her experiences of the war and the occupation. She spoke of many things, but her recollections consistently returned to one indelible image: the sight of her grandson being led out of Sugamo prison by an American soldier. That single moment taught me more about humanity than all the years before it combined, she declared. I learned that kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not surrender. I learned that it is truly possible to defeat your enemy and still treat them with dignity. These, she emphasized, were vital lessons Japan desperately needed to learn, and the Americans imparted them not through mere words, but through their undeniable actions. In 1985, 40 years after the war's tumultuous end, Ko received an invitation to speak at a memorial ceremony honoring the victims of the Tokyo firebombing. She was elderly by then, her hair a cascade of white, her movements slow, yet her mind remained remarkably sharp. As she stood at the podium, she spoke with profound clarity and unwavering passion. She recounted the night the city burned, recalling the sheer terror and the immense loss. She spoke of the long, arduous years of war, the pervasive propaganda, the paralyzing fear. But then she shifted, speaking of that pivotal day at Sugamo prison, and her voice softened, becoming more reflective. I fell to my knees that day, she declared. Not because I was broken, but because I was witnessing something utterly beyond my comprehension. The enemy was returning my daughter to me, healthy and safe. In that singular moment, everything I had ever believed began to irrevocably change. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. Many were young people, born into a generation that had never known the horrors of war, who had grown up in a prosperous, democratic Japan. She wished for them to comprehend the immense cost of their peace, but also the unexpected grace that had made it all possible. War teaches us to hate, she continued, her voice firm. But peace demands that we learn to recognize the humanity in our enemies. The Americans demonstrated that they possessed the power to treat us with cruelty. They chose kindness instead, and that singular choice transformed everything. Years later, upon Ko's passing in 1992, Yuki discovered among her mother's cherished belongings a small, worn piece of paper. It was the very slip the American soldier had given her that pivotal day at Sugamo, the one bearing Yuki's name, meticulously penned in careful English letters. Ko had treasured it all those years, an enduring, tangible reminder of the day when the world ceased to make simple sense, when the enemy revealed their humanity, and when mercy proved to be an exponentially stronger force than hatred. And so, the poignant moment when Japanese mothers collapsed to their knees transcended a mere historical event. It evolved into a powerful symbol of profound transformation, irrefutable proof that even amidst the darkest, most desolate circumstances, humanity can ultimately prevail. The children who were returned that day at Sugamo prison grew up to construct a new Japan, a nation that decisively rejected the militarism of their parents' generation and wholeheartedly embraced democracy and peace. For those mothers, the overwhelming taste of relief, the reassuring feel of their children's hands clasped in theirs. These memories blossomed into symbols of something far grander. They represented the tangible possibility of reconciliation, the enduring hope that former enemies could indeed evolve into allies, and the profound recognition that beneath the uniforms and the pervasive propaganda, we are all, inherently, human beings capable of both immense cruelty and extraordinary kindness. The American soldiers who participated in returning those children rarely spoke of their actions as heroic. To them, it was simply the right thing to do. But for the mothers, it was everything. It was the precise moment when the relentless nightmare of war began its slow, hesitant retreat. It was when the possibility of an entirely different future became palpably real. As one mother recounted to her granddaughter decades later, "We were prepared for utter cruelty. We received unexpected kindness. We expected to lose absolutely everything. We were given back what mattered most. That is not the mercy of the weak. That is the inherent strength of the truly powerful, those who can win and still choose humanity. And that is the story eternally worth remembering." If you found this historical account meaningful and wish to discover more narratives like it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories from World War II, though decades old, continue to offer profound lessons that resonate deeply even today. They serve as a powerful reminder that even in the crucible of war, we possess the capacity to choose mercy. Even when confronted by enemies, we can steadfastly maintain our humanity. And sometimes the most potent weapon is not violence, but rather simple, unwavering human decency. The indelible image of those mothers kneeling in heartfelt gratitude, of children hurtling into waiting arms, of former enemies recognizing each other's shared humanity. This tableau remains one of the most powerfully moving to emerge from World War II. It reminds us that the choices we make in victory define us as profoundly as the battles we win. And it offers a vital beacon of hope, that reconciliation is indeed possible, that hatred can be transformed into understanding, and that the future need not tragically repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this poignant story. Please remember to like this video and subscribe for more historical accounts that illuminate the deeply human side of both war and enduring peace.